Okay, it sounds like based on the message I just got that we're actually just starting now. So I've actually talked just a little bit prior to that message, but I'll go ahead and start over. Welcome to the PowerShell virtual chapter of SQL Pass. My name is Mike F. Robbins, and my presentation is on PowerShell Fundamentals for Beginners. We'll cover a few PowerPoint slides, and we'll spend most of our time doing demo in PowerShell. And we've actually only got 5 slides to cover, so not very many at all. And then the very last slide will be contact information. So the first thing is, what is PowerShell? Because this is really a super new beginner session. And what's this thing called PowerShell? What can it do for me, and why should I care? And I added a screenshot from Microsoft TechNet website so you guys can see the official Microsoft definition of what PowerShell is. And I've added my own definition that I'll show here in just a minute. And Windows PowerShell is a task-based command line shell and scripting language designed especially for system administration. And to me, if it's designed especially for system administration, who does system administration? System administrators do system administration. And that's why I've crossed off language, because as soon as you start talking about this is a language, system administrators are going to say, hey, I'm not a developer. So my definition is PowerShell is an easy-to-use command line shell and scripting interface or environment for automating administrative tasks of Windows-based systems. And the good thing about PowerShell, it doesn't matter if you're a SQL Server administrator, if you're an Active Directory guy, if you're a desktop guy, and even if you're the administrator of a storage area network. Several third-party vendors are now adding PowerShell support, so you can actually provision storage nowadays, even though it's not technically a Microsoft product. Okay, well, let's look at some background information. PowerShell commands are called commandlets, and it's pronounced commandlet, not CMDlet. And commandlets are in the form of singular verb-noun commands. So it'll be get service or get process, not get services or get processes. And one of the reasons for that, there's no standard way in the English language to make the noun portion of the commandlet plural. So PowerShell 1.0, it was installed but not enabled on Windows Vista and Server 2008. So the binaries were on the hard drive, it just wasn't enabled. PowerShell 2.0, it's installed by default on Windows 7 and Server 2008 R2. And the PowerShell IS is installed by default on Windows 7. And it can be installed on Windows XP and Server 2003 or higher. And then PowerShell 3.0, which is the latest revision that's available. It's installed by default on Windows 8 and Server 2012. The ISC is installed by default on Windows 8, and it's actually installed by default on Server 2012 the GUI. So if you put the CD in for Windows Server 2012 and you click next, 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 what you end up with is Server Core. Well, if you do the GUI installation, which is not the default, you will end up with the ISC and Server 2012. So that is a difference between Server 2012 and 2008 R2. And Windows PowerShell 3.0 can be installed on Windows 7 and Server 2008 or higher. And PowerShell remoting is enabled by default on Server 2012. Now there's actually an exception to this slide, and normally when I do this session interactively, I'll ask the audience if anyone knows what the exception is, but I'll go ahead and tell you. on Windows Server 2008 R2 Server Core, PowerShell is actually not enabled by default. So when you initially load Server Core on 2008 R2, you would have to go into sconfig and actually enable PowerShell. Okay. Like I said, this is a really intro level PowerShell session, so I want to get you started at least, how do I start PowerShell? Because a lot of these sessions I see people are already in PowerShell, and a lot of people don't know that PowerShell is installed by default on several operating systems. So on Windows 7 and Server 2008 R2 and prior OSs, you would go to Start, All Programs, Accessories, Windows PowerShell. And this is kind of what your start menu would look like. You'll notice on this particular machine there is 4 PowerShell shortcuts, and that's because this is a Windows 7 machine that is 64-bit. So you have 32-bit shortcuts and 64-bit ones. Of course, the x86 ones are the 32-bit ones, and the ones without a number are the 64-bit. I actually always run the 64-bit ones, and unless you run into an issue, that's my recommendation. Now, I have heard that there are certain modules or snap-ins that will not work with the 64-bit, although I've never run into one that wouldn't. So if you're running the 64-bit versions and you run into an issue, then go ahead and try the 32-bit version. So on Windows 8 and Server 2012, it's actually accessed through the All Applications page, and that's kind of where we're going to start this the demonstration at. I think we have one more slide at this point. So one of the things I commonly hear from people who are new to PowerShell is, how do I figure out what the commands are? So what we're going to do during this presentation is we're going to learn to investigate and explore PowerShell. We're going to learn, you can figure out what the commands are from within PowerShell without using an internet search engine. And there are several things on this slide that are in red, and those are the primary things we'll be covering. So the core commands for discovering how to use PowerShell is, the first one is get help, and the way I use it is I use get help to figure out how to use commands. Now you can also use it to discover commands, to figure out what the commands are, but there's another commandlet that's better for discovering the commands, in my opinion, and that commandlet is get command. And it's used to find out what commands are available. And then we have get member. So these are really the 3 core commandlets that, no matter if you're a SQL administrator, AD guy, if you're an Exchange guy, if you're a SharePoint guy and you're using PowerShell, you have to know how to use these. So get member is used to discover objects, properties, and methods. And usually when you start talking about objects, properties, and methods, we read earlier that PowerShell is designed for system administration. And when you start talking to a system administrator about objects, properties, and methods, once again, he's going to say, hey, I'm not a developer. But you don't have to be a developer to use PowerShell. So when you run PowerShell, you want to run as administrator, because PowerShell is not able to participate in user access control or UAC. So it can't ask for elevated privileges, and you'll end up with cryptic error messages if you don't run it as a local administrator on the box. Okay, and at this time we're actually going to jump into the demo portion of this presentation. Okay, and what we have is a virtual machine. And when you boot up to Windows 8, this is what you have. So you have the Metro interface. Well, the way you find PowerShell with this, the easiest way is just start typing PowerShell, and it'll come up Windows PowerShell. So what I like to do is right-click on this and pin it to the taskbar. So that way, when you actually go to the desktop view, it is here on the taskbar at the very bottom. Because one of the problems, if you just start typing it in, and we'll go ahead and do that again. And I'll go ahead and adjust the font because I know this is going to be very difficult to see. And I believe this, like I said, this is a new machine that's freshly built. Okay, so you'll notice it does not say administrator in the bar at the top. It just says Windows PowerShell, and that's the first key to know that, hey, I'm not running PowerShell as an administrator. And we're going to jump into the ISE fairly quickly here because I know SQL guys prefer to use the ISE. Just going to show you, and you would run into the same error in the ISE, which stands for Integrated Scripting Environment. So if I did something very simple like, let's just do a stop service. And bits, and say I hit tab, then it has what's called tabbed expansion. So you can type part of a commandlet and press tab, and in this case I actually typed part of a service name and pressed tab, and it completed it for me. So for those of us who cannot type, that's a huge benefit. So anyway, stop service bits, we'll get an error, and it's very cryptic. It doesn't tell you what the problem is. So this is one of the problems that newcomers to PowerShell will run into. And this is because we're not, of course, a standard user can't stop a service on a Windows machine. And you'll hear some of my recommended best practices during this presentation, and you can take them for what they're worth, but you shouldn't log into servers and administer them from the console or from RDP. You should install the tools on your computer and manage them remotely. And that's really the way that Microsoft is going, because with Server Core, if you log in remotely, all you're going to get is a command prompt anyway. So what we're going to do is go ahead and close PowerShell. And typically what I'll do is hold down Shift and right-click and select Properties, go to Advanced, and click the check mark that says Run as Administrator. And that way, every time that I run PowerShell, it's going to run as an administrator. So now I can right-click on this and run the ISE as administrator, but I'm going to run PowerShell one more time. And since I'm logged in as a non-administrator account, it is asking me for administrator credentials. Now, I recommend running PowerShell as a local admin, but not a domain admin. Now this actually is a test domain, so we're going to break that rule at this point. There's only a couple of accounts in this domain. And the only thing I want you to see here is now it says administrator, and then it says Windows PowerShell. So I'm not going to adjust the font. The only thing I'm going to do is type in ISE, which is Integrated Scripting Environment, and that is an alias, and it will actually launch the ISE for me. And you'll also notice that anything you launch from PowerShell when you're running it as an administrator will also be run as an administrator, and that's why it ran the ISE as an administrator. So keep that in mind. So if you run anything even like Notepad, it's going to run Notepad with elevated user access control. So one thing I really like about the ISE is it has this zoom tool, so I don't have to adjust my font for you guys. And we can type in the script here and save it. And we'll actually go ahead and do that, because one of the other things, there's actually another issue that you need to be aware of that newcomers will run into. So if we type in the same command as before, we do stop service fits. And by default, stop service does not produce any objects or any output. So when we run this, it's actually going to stop the service, and it worked great. It just didn't give us any output. Well, there is actually a pass-through parameter for many commandlets that don't produce output that will cause them to create output. So you can see this time that we actually got output that, hey, the service was stopped. Well, it was already stopped, so it didn't really do anything. But what I want to show you in this, the issue that I was just talking about, is this command's working fine. So we're just going to save it. And now if we run this exact command again, it generates an error. And that's because of the execution policy. By default, for the local machine, it is actually set to restricted. And that prevents PowerShell scripts from running on any machine by default. So, and the reason it ran before we saved it is because it wasn't a script before we saved it. So what we'll do, we'll actually, this is very similar to the console. We'll do a get execution policy, and you see it is restricted. Now there is actually more than one execution policy. So if we did scope, current user, you can see it's undefined. So if you do not have administrative privileges on your machine, you can actually, and a higher level policy such as the local machine is not overriding it, you can actually set the execution policy for the current user, which is stored in the current user portion of the registry. And you can run scripts as a non-admin user, and a lot of people don't realize that. But what we're going to go ahead and do is set the execution policy to remote signed, which is what I recommend. And you'll get this prompt, and I'll go ahead and say yes. And that does, it of course does slightly reduce the security because you're allowing the execution of scripts. But what it does not allow, even if you have scripts saved on a file share, unless that is in your unless that is in your trusted zone for inside Internet Explorer, then you still won't be able to run those scripts. And it may be the local intranet zone for that. There are other execution policies that you can set, but I personally don't set mine to a lower execution policy than remote signed. So now if we go back to our script, it's saved, it runs, and it runs fine. So what I want to do now is jump over to the get help commandlet, and we will do this interactively. So get help, and we're going to get help on get help. And the first time you run help, and you'll notice this machine help is, I've never run the get help commandlet at all. So with PowerShell version 3, help does not ship in the box. It has some abbreviated help, but not very much help at all. And the reason for that is the way that help was designed in version 2 as part of the operating system, you know, it's difficult enough to get a bug actually fixed in a service pack. So if there's an issue with a text document that is a help document, then it's almost impossible to get that fixed. So this allows the help to be updated outside of service packs. So we're actually going to say no at this point. And what I want to show you is actually I want to go back to the update help. So let's do so the commandlet you would want to run is update help, and I have these downloaded. So I can tell it, I can give it a path. And I have them downloaded on a machine called DCO2. And you'll notice even tabbed expansion works for that UNC path. If you run this, by default, it will only update your help once a day, and there's a force parameter, but we won't need that since help has never been run. And since we're running this console as an administrator who does have access to the domain controller, we don't have to specify credentials. Now, if you did not have access to where this is stored, you could specify the credential parameter, and you could use get credential, and that would actually prompt you for alternate credentials. And that's really the way I recommend to run scripts, is that specify elevated credentials as needed. So this will take just a second here, and you'll see it come across the screen. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. This is a virtual machine, and if it does, we'll jump back over to the console while that is updating. And we'll go ahead and adjust our font here just in case that does take a couple minutes. Okay, it looks like it's running now. So you'll see the progress bar come across the screen for each module it's updating. You know, you probably want to update your help in PowerShell about once a week, and now it's updated. So if you're in the console and you run get help, then it actually gives you all the help, and it doesn't page it. But there is a function called help that actually will break it down a page at a time. Now, since we're in the ISC, help and get help operate exactly the same because you have a scroll bar, so it doesn't give it to you a page at a time. So I want you to be aware of something called aliases. So I'm going to run help on get alias. And the reason I chose this commandlet is it only has 2 parameter sets. So you'll see it has one parameter set that has name as a parameter, and the other parameter set actually has definition in it. And you'll notice the first one does not have definition and the second one does not have name. So each parameter set will have at least one unique parameter between it. And what that means is I cannot use the name parameter and the definition parameter in the same command. It's almost like 2 different commands, and I'll show you an example of that. So a lot of times on blogs you'll see these cryptic aliases. So if I do get alias, and we'll just do get alias GAL. So you'll notice gal is an alias for get alias. Well, maybe I don't know what the aliases are for get alias. So, and I'm not going to run the one on get alias because if I put the same command in there twice, it's going to be a little confusing for you. So we would do a definition, and where object is one you'll often see that's an alias on blogs. And the question mark is the one that I like to show people, because that's something that a lot of people use on their blogs, and I don't recommend that because people who are new to PowerShell won't know what it means. Now, I will use where, and I'll use sort, and I'll use select instead of saying where object or sort object or select object, because in my opinion everything in PowerShell is an object, so if it says where, then you can just assume it's where object. Okay, let's make sure that we're covering everything I wanted to cover. So finding commands, and I know today I'm talking to the SQL community, so what I've done is I've actually loaded the just the basic management tools on this PC. So I have a module that was loaded with those basic tools, and it is called SQL PS. And I believe there's actually 2 modules that's loaded. So if I do a SQL star, I think there will be a couple of, and there's a couple of modules. So if I want to know what commandlets were added with the SQL PS module, what I can do is do a get command. And there are aliases for like get command, it's GCM, but this presentation will be very verbose because it's hard enough for newcomers to PowerShell to learn PowerShell without having to learn all the cryptic aliases initially. So name is actually a positional parameter, so you could actually omit that, but the one we're specifically looking for is module. So SQL PS. So what this command will do, get command module SQL PS, it will give me a list of all the commandlets that are in that module. And hopefully we don't have to wait too long for this machine. Jump over to the, okay, we did. I try to keep 2 commands going, and you can run commands as like a job, and that's a little more advanced. But that way you can immediately get your prompt back. So you can continue to work, and you can actually go back and get the status of those jobs. But these are all the commandlets, and you can see there's one function that were added as part of this SQL PS module. So that's how you would find the commandlets. And you'll notice I'm actually in a SQL Server drive at this point. So I'm sure everybody knows how to maneuver at the command prompt. And I will use an alias called dir, which is an alias to get child item. So if I did a dir on there, I could do a change directory, and change directory is an alias for set location. So I can see my local machine, but I have a machine called SQL02. So I can change directory of that. I can do a dir. I can see it was installed with the default instance. Now, one thing I have found, if I tried to use the tabbed expansion with this instance name, it would hang up for a couple of minutes and finally time out, and IntelliSense would. So this should start looking familiar to SQL folks. So I can actually change directory directly into the database directory, and I can see a list of my databases. And what I can do, I can actually do a dir, and I can pipe this to a format table, and we have a table already, but I want specific properties. And property is a positional parameter once again, so it can be omitted. And I know for a new PowerShell person, a lot of this is very vague, but it's what I'm trying to do is give you an overview, because you certainly can't learn PowerShell in an hour, but you can get a head start, and then at the end of this I'll tell you where to find more information. So the properties, and what you can do for, what I'll do a lot of times, I'll just say select, which is select object, and I'll ask for the first one, and then I'll do a format list star. We actually did get an error there. But specifically what I'm looking for, and this gives us data and the property names. Now what you could do, we discussed the get member earlier. So we could actually pipe the entire directory or get child item to get member. And what that will do is give us a list of methods and properties. And a method, of course, is an action you can take on the item, like stopping a service or starting a service. And a property is like the color of the car, it has 4 doors, it has 4 tires, and so on. But I know this has a name property, and it also has a last backup date. So what I want to do a dir, I want to do a format table, And we'll actually go ahead and type this out because I'm trying not to use aliases, although I use them interactively all the time. We want the name and the last backup, and we can actually use a star there. I believe it's called last backup. Let's see. Oh, I put a dot in there instead of. So there we go. We have a list of our databases. We can see the last time they were all backed up, and that was earlier today. I believe there's also one called create date. Just in case, we'll do an asterisk on that one. So we can see those databases were created back in March. Those are some SharePoint databases. And this is a test environment. We can see the last backup date. So, and you can actually run this against multiple SQL servers. So, to me, it's very neat to be able to pull this type of information basically out of DOS prompt. It's like DOS on steroids. So let's go back to our C prompt. Let's go ahead and just clear the screen at this point. So what I want to show you, one of the misconceptions I hear from a lot of people, I'm going to go back to the start service and stop service scenario. We're actually going to do a get service, and we're going to do a get service on bits, and it should be stopped. So I hear from a lot of people who are new to PowerShell that with get commandlets, you can't perform an action on them. You can't stop a service. You know, they think I can tell a junior level admin, hey, you can run all the get commandlets you want because you can't do anything dangerous with them. You can't perform an action. Well, that's actually not true. And typically you would use the commandlet like start service to do this, but I just kind of want to make a point that don't assume that you can damage a system or take action. And damage is probably not a good word. You can't do any, that's one thing with PowerShell. A lot of people worry about security. You can't do anything with PowerShell that you don't have rights to do anyway. So PowerShell is kind of a means to an end. It's another way of accomplishing the same task. Now it generally is much more efficient than using the GUI. So if you know you can go into the GUI and screw things up, well, with PowerShell you can just screw them up a lot faster if that's you know, if you don't know what you're doing. But also you really need to use PowerShell. Don't be afraid of it. So anyway, let's go ahead and do a get service bits, and let's pipe that to get member. And we can see that we actually have a start method. So what we'll do is put that in parentheses. Start. And back-to-back parentheses. Okay, we'll do a get service again on bits, and you'll notice now the service is running. So if I did the same thing, and I did a stop, just to make sure you saw that. So the service is stopped again. So even though it's a get commandlet, and with its name you kind of think it's read-only, it's not read-only. You can perform actions. Now in PowerShell, typically you do have commandlets for those common items, such as, and we certainly don't want to stop our computer. We want to, we actually want to start the service at this point. And one thing I want to show you with this, earlier I mentioned that this did not produce any objects. So we'll try to pipe this to get member. And of course we get an error. No object has been specified to the get member commandlet. So you can use pass-through, and you can actually return objects so that you can pipe it to get member. And the way you find out what parameters are available for that, of course, is the help commandlet. So if you did help stop, one good thing about tab expansion is if you press tab and it does not expand, then you type something wrong. So, you know, I mentioned before it's great for the people who can't type, including me. So it keeps you from having a lot of errors on the screen when you're doing a presentation like this. So help stop service, and my new favorite PowerShell version 3 option for help is the show window, because it brings up a window that I can of course maximize, but I can drag it off to another monitor and I can continue to work in PowerShell without tying up my PowerShell window. Excuse me. And if you're like me, you know, most people nowadays, unless you're on a laptop, you probably have multiple monitors, so you can drag this help off to another screen and be going through the help. And I believe even the show window does have a zoom tool, so we can zoom in so that you guys can see this a little bit better. So you'll notice that stop service, we actually use the positional parameter of name. And you'll notice that it has a pass-through parameter. So if you're using PowerShell version 2, you can use the online parameter, or with help, or get help, of course, or you can use the full parameter, and it will give you this same information. Of course, online primarily works with the built-in commandlets. It doesn't work with all commandlets, especially third-party ones, but the full parameter will. So if we scroll down to pass-through, so you can get details on particular parameters. And you can also see whether it's required or not. So pass-through, of course, is not required. And it will tell you if it's positional and that particular parameter is named. You can see that in the details, and especially for newcomers, it's very easy to see it there. Now, all the square brackets and that sort of stuff that looks very cryptic, it actually means something. So let's see. And there are some very good books on this subject. I mean, the PowerShell in a Month of Lunches series by Manning, the new one is written by Don Jones and Jeff Hicks. I've read those books, and the version 2 version of that book is really where I got started with PowerShell, and it explains what all this means in detail. Now, the string, of course, when you have square brackets, that means that it will accept an array of strings. So I could actually use a comma-separated list and stop multiple services. The name is actually, let's see, that is actually a positional parameter there. But like I said, I'm not going to go in detail about that, because for a newcomer, you can actually look at this portion of the detail and get the same information. Okay. So make sure how much time we have left. It looks like we've got around 15 minutes left. So we'll go another.
See if anyone had questions at this point, or.
Sure. Do we have any questions?
Haven't had anything significant in the queue yet.
Okay. Yeah, if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat, and I'll go ahead and proceed for another 5 minutes or so, and then we'll cover any questions.
Sounds good, Mike.
Okay, and there's several new things that most people don't realize with PowerShell version 3. One thing that was kind of difficult to find, if I run git command, and there is actually an option, parameter name, and of course this is something I haven't tested here recently. So let's see, yeah, that did what I thought it would do. What this did, this gave me a list of all commandlets on my machine that are currently imported that have a computer name parameter. So if you're looking for a commandlet or a list of commandlets that have a specific parameter. This is new to PowerShell version 3. There was a way to do this in version 2, but it was much more difficult. So these are the commandlets that I could use to run against a remote computer without using PowerShell remoting. Now, of course, with Server 2012, most of these are going to use WMI, and that's going to be blocked by the firewall in newer operating systems by default. But with Server 2012 and PowerShell remoting being enabled, it's very easy to, PowerShell remoting. There's several different ways. You can do an inter-PS session, which is kind of a one-to-one remoting. You can do implicit remoting. You actually don't necessarily have to have the SQL tools or the Active Directory tools installed on your machine. You can actually import them remotely to your machine and use them on your machine as if they were installed locally through implicit remoting. And then you have like invoke command, which is a one-to-many type remoting. So if I ran invoke command and I have computer name DC02 and SQL02, and what I tell people about, I actually want to go back and cover one other thing that is a difference in PowerShell version 2 and 3 real quick. That's a little more important for newcomers than the PowerShell remoting. If we just run get process. So this is a list of processes running on this machine. Well, we see we have a lot of service hosts. So let's go ahead and do a -name SVC host. So we use name, and there is a few different parameter sets with get process. So if I do help on get process, and you'll notice I didn't do a full or detailed or examples, so I just got the very basic help. And the syntax is what I want to show you here. So we use -name. So there's another one that has an ID. And a lot of people they can't figure out how to use name and ID in the same command. They say, well, it's in two different parameter sets. There's no way that I can do that. Well, you actually can. You want to filter left just like I've filtered to the name without piping without using a pipe symbol, because everything that the first part of the command produces is going to be piped to the next command. So always try to filter it down to the minimum possible results at the first part of the command. And in the SQL community, it's kind of like you don't want to do a select star from the table. You want to do a, select the columns you need and do a where, so that you're only getting the results that you need, especially for bringing this across the network from a remote machine. So what we could do if we wanted to use ID in the same one, we could pipe it to where, and of course that is where object. And we would say where ID, and maybe we want the ones that are greater than 1,000. So there's 3 of them that are greater than 1,000, so we just use name and ID in the same command. Well, if you want to use a compound where statement, you can't use the new version 3 syntax, which is what I just used. So you would say where, and you would have a script block. And don't try to think of the script block in the English language, because if you try to remember curly braces, $, underscore, dot, you'll never remember that. So it's curly braces, and the $, underscore is the current object, and the dot is the ID is going to be one property of that object. So greater than 1,000, and let's see, handles, we'll use handles. $, underscore, dot, handles. And actually it's handle. So the name of the column is not always the name of the property. And that's one of the reasons you would want to pipe this to get member, is to get the true names of the columns. So when handle is greater than 250. So let's see if that works. And that didn't work. So maybe it is handles. And if it doesn't work, we'll go pipe it to get member and see, let's see, $. Yeah, so it was handles. But the columns like working set with the kilobytes and virtual memory with the megabytes, in order to determine what those are, the real names of those, you could pipe it to get member and GM as a alias to that. So you can see you've got working set. And so WS is actually an alias property. So do we have any questions at this point?
Yeah, Mike, we've got several. I'll tee you up with the first one, which is, I would like to know how to copy from the console. And as you know, I don't.
Sure.
So I don't even know.
Sure. Let's go ahead and adjust our font in this console. That's and one thing I will tell you is most of the DOS stuff, if you were ever a DOS user, and I was, all the DOS stuff you ever used works great. So if I'm typing something in, or maybe I've got results, whatever it is, let's just do so an alias for get process is PS. So if I want to copy something out of here like these results, what you'll need to do is select properties, and this quick edit mode needs to be selected inside the edit options. And that's just like the DOS prompt. So at that point you could actually select this, and I'm gonna do it this way, and then I'm going to show you an even better way to do this. So you press enter. We're going to start Notepad, Control V, and there's our results. We just copy and pasted that.
Cool.
So if you want the results, an even better way to do that is PS and just pipe it to clip.
Yep.
Every machine's got clip.exe, so if we went back to Notepad and we did a paste, then there's my results.
All right.
So you can put them in the clipboard.
Next question. Can you provide a little info on the -what if parameter?
Sure. The what if, if we did stop service, then and we did an asterisk, that would probably be really bad. That would probably be the end of this session because my machine would probably die.
It would definitely be bad.
So that's, I would recommend using what if definitely anytime, especially if you're gonna. Not every commandlet supports what if, but almost every command that makes system changes does support what if. So if now I can run this and it'll tell me what it would have done. It would have stopped every service on my machine. What if will save your job is what it boils down to. And every commandlet that supports what if, so let's do a stop service and we'll do something simple. We'll do a bits. And there's actually a confirm. And let's do more than bits. Let's do bits, and let's do Win32 time, I believe. Maybe it's not Win32 time. Anyway, if I did stop service bits and I did a confirm and pressed enter, it would actually confirm that. And if you had the whole list of processes on the machine, you could say yes or no to each one individually. And you could actually suspend this command. And you see now I've got like a different prompt. And then you could go in and check something like maybe you want to do a get service on bits. So you could do a get service, and when you press exit, it will put you back there, and then you could say, no, I don't really want to stop that service.
Very cool. Right, the next question is, any idea if POSH will support UAC in the future? What other workarounds from running commandlets that require administrator exists?
Yeah, the workaround is run your PowerShell console as a local admin. I know that's not possible for everybody, but that's the only workaround, and I've not heard of any changes to UAC as far as PowerShell. Now, what I have heard, and I heard this from very reliable sources at TechEd, is that today you have to tap into the .NET framework to determine if PowerShell is running as an administrator. And I actually did that in one of my scripting games events. I think it was the last one, because my command would fail if it wasn't running as administrator. So I would do like a if else to say, hey, if it's running as administrator, go ahead and run this command, else give the user a message. But anyway, I've been told by reliable sources that they are actually going to put some sort of commandlet or something into PowerShell to be able to check to see if PowerShell is running as an administrator instead of having to tap into the .NET framework.
Yep. There's also another way to fire up a command and elevate it, and I'll shoot you a link for that one here in a second. We've got a short amount of time, and we got some more questions, so let's go on. Next question was someone that had created a batch file to execute and have PowerShell start in the batch file. Once PowerShell starts within the batch file, none of the regular PowerShell commands like change directory work. I have done that in the past, but I'm not familiar with troubleshooting it.
There's my contact information. Anybody who does not get their questions answered is welcome to contact me offline. Also, like I said earlier, I do run the Mississippi PowerShell user group. We have an official meeting every month on Patch Tuesday at 8:30 p.m. Central Time, and we typically team up with the Florida PowerShell user group on the third Tuesday of the month. So starting next week, we'll be back. We typically also get together each week for an unofficial meeting. So when the weeks that those unofficial meetings are not going on, we love to get people in our meeting, and we don't have a specific agenda. We just get in there and let everybody talk, and we just say, okay, what kind of issues are you having, or what kind of questions do you have, and we just work on that. And you know, I was the advanced scripting games winner this year, and Ron Edwards, who's my co-founder of the user group, was the advanced competition winner last year, and he's more on the developer side, and I'm on the sysadmin side. So we generally have pretty good answers in there. What you can do, you can run PowerShell from the command line, and if you go out and run PowerShell.exe and just put a /? behind it, it'll give you all the options. I still don't think that'll get around. I don't know that you can run as an administrator if that command prompt is not running as an administrator. I have not done that yet.
All right. Back over here to see if there's any other ones. There's a long one. You're going to have to read it. Bottom question. And I think that, let's see. Yeah. Oh, it's part of L1. Andy Galbraith says that the workaround is to disable UAC. Thank you, Andy. Brilliant move.
I wouldn't recommend disabling UAC because you're just inviting other issues.
I know. Yeah, sorry, that was tongue-in-cheek in case anyone couldn't tell. And I'm actually searching Chad Miller's blog right now because he has one way of getting around some of this, but I can't seem to find it right at this moment.
Yeah, and there's some really good people out there in the SQL community. You know, Max Trinidad, I think his name is Ben Miller, who was at SQL Saturday in Atlanta a few weeks ago. The Midnight DBAs, they're PowerShell guys, and Sean is a Microsoft Certified Master. So, and for anybody who, I've done the session several times. It's different every time I do it. I'll be speaking the first weekend in August at SQL Saturday in Baton Rouge as well.
Right, and I guess that is it.
And the PowerShell Deep Dives book that I wrote a chapter in, that's an excellent book. It's each chapter is kind of individual, so you can read one chapter and not have to read the entire book. And everybody who wrote a chapter in that book donated their time, so nobody's getting paid. I put a couple hundred hours into my chapter, and my chapter specifically working with auditing the event logs, and it has some stuff in there that you really wouldn't find anywhere else. Like if you have a user who's being locked out from a machine, you want to determine what the machine is. those events are replicated to the PDC emulator, so you can actually query one domain controller, and then the machine that is causing the lockout is actually a property, so it's very easy to find that information with PowerShell. I want to thank you guys for inviting me to come speak today.
Yep. A good crowd out here. Over 80 people join us. And
great.
So glad we got this information out to all these folks. Thanks for doing this for us, Mike.
Thank you. Y'all have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks. You too.